All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for another semester at the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. Of course, I am Dr. Robert Green II, the lead instructor for the Simkins School of Human Rights, and we are pleased and thrilled to see folks here in Columbia at the Grow Building. Also, we have folks joining us from Sumter, from the Penn Center, and from all over South Carolina. And according to chat, folks from all across the country are joining us this evening. So this is a very, very exciting time. And I can assure you, unlike the case with my college courses, the first class will not be a syllabus day, but instead will be covering some real awesome material. So before we get into our actual work today, I want to introduce, or many of you reintroduce, Brett Bursey, who wants to share a few words with us this afternoon, including about some of the folks who are helping to support the school this semester. Brett, come on.
Was John Trudell, and John Trudell he died unfortunate early death, but Trudell was a mini conju of the Sioux people, and that we'll have tomorrow night somebody with us that is related to not tomorrow night, next Sunday for the deeper dive that Professor Judge will host with T. Lily Littlewater. But Trudell was somebody that I had the occasion to know about in like 1970, 68, when the American Indian movement was getting together. And that in 1970, there was an occupation of the Alcatraz Island that Trudell was at, and they had a radio station, stayed there for like a year. And then there was Wounded Knee protest on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where one of the people that helped start Grow, a friend of mine, was there. And we made great friends with a lot of the people who were American Indian movement leaders. And I had the opportunity to go to Geneva with them for the Second World Conference of Racism in 1984. And that I was the only white male American amongst 132 nations. And the only 3 nations that boycotted that conference were Israel, South Africa, and the United States. Those 3 may sound familiar. But Trudell did a lot of great stuff, and what we're going to do is get into that much deeper next Sunday week. This coming Sunday, it's the 9th, Chris, when we have the deeper dive at 4 o'clock, and we'll have these deeper dives on Sundays that are focusing on a particular thing that is worth lifting up and spending time on to put some flesh and bones on the history that we talk about in summary. And I wanted to mention that we'll be doing more about the Native American struggle on Sunday. We'll expand on that. And Dr. Gallman will start his ancient African American lectures on the subsequent Sunday, which I think is the 16th.
Yes.
And those are going to be at 6:30, and everybody will get the links to those. And again, those are public. And I did want to recognize Robert Adams. Dr. Adams, can you show yourself out there? Dr. Robert Adams is the new, well, relatively new, very relative, since the institution itself was started in 1862. And Dr. Adams was the first breath of fresh air in a long time there. Penn's had such a difficult time being able to make a living doing what they used to do, which is teaching people how to fight for justice and freedom. It's hard. It's hard. And so they have kind of gone through a downward process of come see what we used to do. And now Dr. Adams is lifting it up to see what you can do, knowing what we used to do. And I'm so excited to be able to have Dr. Adams with us. Dr. Adams, you hear me? Oh, he's waving there. Stand up and say something.
Yes, I can. You know, it's great to be here with the statewide movement. I think it's super important that we work together in these incredible times. I think through collective action, we can make a difference.
Thank you, sir. And then at Penn is Bernadette Hampton, one of our board members, former president of the South Carolina Educational Association, when she went to the Modjeska School in 2017. And people are calling to try and find out how to get here. It's too late. And that Candace Dorr is with us, and Candace is somebody who's entrenched there in the neighborhood. She's been working with us for a while, helping the Gullah Farmers Co-op, which is there on St. Helena. and her mother is executive director of the Gulf Farmers Co-op. And my old Beaufort roots, I graduated from Beaufort High School, segregated Beaufort High School in 1966, and saw King speak at Penn in '65. So that's my neighborhood. But I now want to recognize our people in Sumter. Jim Felder, can you hear me? I'll talk about Jim while he's finding his microphone. But I met Jim in 1968.
All right, Brett.
Hey, Jim. Let me tell people that I met you in '68 and started working with you then when he was the executive director of the South Carolina Voter Education Project. And Jim, before he did that, he was a lawyer, and before he did that, he was in the military, and he was in the honor guard at the Arlington National Cemetery and was in charge of the burial of JFK. So he's got a lot of stories to tell, but the one that's particularly prescient is Jim in 1970 became the first Black elected official. There were 3 House members that were elected, and the first since the Reconstruction was beat back in 1877. We fast forward to the 1895 Constitution, and from the late 1890s until 1970, there were no Black elected officials in South Carolina, and the Democratic Party was the white one. Jim, say hello and tell us who you've got there.
Well, we got a collection of Sumter people here. Others are still coming. We had a little confusion on the time, but they're coming in, and they're here to learn. We're excited that we can have this satellite operation in Sumter.
Well, this is an important and necessary shakedown cruise, and I'm sure we'll have more people as we cruise along here. Dr. Green, lead us forward.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Brett. And I have to say, I couldn't help but chuckle as we were going to our sites at the Penn Center in Sumter. Now, I'm a big Star Trek fan, so it feels like we're talking to other people on a view screen right now. So this is actually pretty awesome for me personally. And I think before we go on, think about how awesome a tool this actually is. Now, granted, as an educator who has been in academia since before COVID, I have witnessed the highs and lows of using Zoom in the classroom, more so lows than highs. However, I think this is a testament to what this technology can be used for, that we're able to organize and galvanize people across the state and in some cases across the country to come together and to learn this information at the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. So with all that being said, tonight we're going to really look at 2 things. Of course, the title of tonight's conversation, I prefer to call them conversations as opposed to lectures, is Stolen Land and Stolen People. The first half of this will be about the stolen land component. The second half will be about the stolen people component. But keep in mind that those 2 are heavily intertwined, as you'll see both this evening and in classes to come. So I am pleased and thrilled to welcome our first guest to the school this evening, Professor Chris Judge out of USC Lancaster, who for decades has done tremendous work on Indigenous life right here in South Carolina, both as an archaeologist and also through oral history interviews as well. Professor Judge has been with the Modjeska Simkins School for the last few years, and every year he gives this particular lecture, I learned something new about Indigenous life in South Carolina. And it's important that we start with the Indigenous peoples of this state, because in many ways, the treatment that they've received at the hands of European colonizers was a preview of things to come, both here in South Carolina and throughout the Americas. So without further ado, let's give a warm Modjeska School welcome to Professor Chris Judge.
Well, thanks to Robert and Brett, Becky, Chris over there, the bass player, IT guy, and Gabby for running the school and having me back. I'm delighted to be here. Before we start, I am a member of the unrecognized Celtic tribe of Ireland. Don't let the ponytail fool you. I'm a white guy. I don't speak for Native people. I speak from the archaeological record and what it's told me and my colleagues over many, many years. And I think before I start this year, I'm going to say it's about democracy, it's about justice, it's about time. Could never be more important in this country as it is right now. So I'm going to talk about Native Americans and what is now known as South Carolina. There we go. And I'm gonna take a deep dive and go, well, deep dive's next Sunday. But I'm gonna take a deep dive into the past, and we'll start in the Ice Age with the first Native Americans in South Carolina. A lot of people don't know how far back this goes, but starting around 16,000 years ago, we've got a little bit of evidence that people are here. There's one site in Allendale County on the Savannah River that has really good evidence of those people. Mobile hunter-gatherers, no fixed abode, they don't stay in one place. Very lightweight toolkit. They have to be able to carry everything with them, a child and all their gear on the march. And the reason for that is they're following mobile herds of large animals like mastodon and mammoth, that they go where the rainfall is. They go where fresh grass is. And so you have to be ready to pick up and move. So in this painting, you see rather ephemeral houses, probably built in less than an hour. The group is a kin-related network. It's all the people that you're related to in your extended family. And some people call them in-laws, others outlaws, the people that marry into your family is your group. And you move around with that group. We know them through spear points that have been found. And what the locations of those tell us is that those people favor where large creeks go into major rivers. And if you think about it, that's the interstate highway and the exits. You know, it's where you can get off. And when you go to that big creek, it's like the interstate highway. You know, there's gonna be a place to stay. You realize you forgot your toothbrush and you go over to Walgreens, right? And then there's Chinese takeout over here. And you know that those things are there, and those big creeks offered people those things. So they favor those places. And this goes on for about 6,000 years to about 10,000 years ago. And as you know, about 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age comes to an end worldwide. We would have had a climate in the Paleo-Indian period, the 16 to 10,000 years, much like upstate New York. You would have long, cold winters, and you would have some summer, but not like we have it here in South Carolina. Now, another thing that would be hard to believe, you're from South Carolina, there was no pine trees in South Carolina. It was all hardwood forests. It wasn't warm enough. They're down in Florida, but they hadn't migrated up here. Okay, so the landscape looked different. The animals were different. And 10,000 years ago, all those 25 to 30 species of animals become extinct. Llamas, horses, Geochelone, the giant land tortoise, are all gone. And all of a sudden, people have to focus in a very, very different way. And so they're all of a sudden, the big game are elk and deer and bear. And, you know, the Paleo-Indian people would have a spear and they'd walk up to a mastodon and stab it in the belly. All of a sudden, we're going after really fast game, and we have to change our strategies. We have to change our toolkit to meet that. So the early archaic, for about from 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, is adapting to a very different landscape, climate regime. The fauna and the flora are very, very different. And what we see is people start to, rather than focus on big game, they widen up their palate and they're subsisting on many different, wide variety of game, both small and large. So in this painting, there's people in the river collecting shellfish. Some hunters have come back with some turkeys. The folks in the foreground are processing nuts. Anybody ever eaten an acorn? How did it taste? Terrible. You know why? They're poisonous. Not going to kill you. You're probably going to hurl. But the Indians figured out that that was a really good food, but they had to remove the poison. Very labor intensive. You got to collect them and you got to get there before the deer, the bear, and the turkey get them, and squirrels and everything else. You then have to break them open, and that's what's going on here. They're breaking open, separating shell from meat. Then the meat goes in a basket. And if you live in a oak forest that produces acorns and you burn oak wood in your fire pit, there's lye in the ash. So they throw the ash in the basket, pour water through, get rid of that. Very labor intensive process, but it's a very predictable source of protein. The deer run away from you, the nuts don't. The deer are sketchy and around sometimes and not others. The nuts are there when? Spring, right? Oh. You know exactly when you're going to get them. So they developed strategies to go after much smaller food in the early archaic. The middle archaic starting about 8,000 years ago, is a time of drastic change. Now, can you imagine South Carolina being hotter than it is today? Because in the Middle Archaic, it got hotter than it is today by 5 to 10 degrees. Now, what that does is it produces incredible plant growth. Animals that live on plants do really well, and people that go after plants and animals that eat plants do really well. Population explosion. Up until now, people are living along the rivers in the Paleo-Indian and the early Archaic. They're now living everywhere. My professor Al Goodyear said the points of the Middle Archaic are like ticks on a dog. There's a lot of them and they're everywhere. And they are. They're in places way far from the river, not near water, probably near spring heads. And so we see a population explosion at that time and a simplification of the spear points. They make really well-made ones early on, and then that kind of goes away. It's the difference between a screwdriver that's made by like craftsmen, as opposed to, some of you are old enough to remember the blue light specials at Kmart, 59 cents, blue light goes off and you get a screwdriver, it turns a screw 59 times and falls apart. Middle Archaic points are like that, and the early ones are the craftsmen, built to last. You say, I got mad and I took a sledgehammer and I beat those screwdrivers to death, and Sears will give you a brand new pair. They're guaranteed for life. Okay, so the early points are like that. The later points are more like the blue light special. All right, at 5,000 years ago, back to the river. We're not sure why, but the emphasis goes back to the river, and the resources include lots of shellfish. We see for the first time rather substantial houses, and what that tells us is they're staying in one place at least for a few months. They're D-shaped structures. They're semi-subterranean, maybe 18 inches down into the ground. They dig, cover that. The flat side is the entrance, arc around the back, and so they're building substantial structures. At this time, the subsistence is stayed much the same, with the one change of an increased amount of shellfish used. Now, down at the coast, we have things called shellfish. People down in Penn Center have probably heard about the shell rings along the coast. There's a lot of them in Beaufort County, and these are deposits of garbage manipulated into architectural constructs. So the one on the right there with the red arrow pointing onto it is 30 feet smaller than a football field. Talking about a very large area, 270 feet across, 30 feet wide at the base and 8 feet tall. Landfill, mainly oyster, some razor clams, some conch, some periwinkle, and they are making these, we call them monuments. We think these are constructs to celebrate or memorialize certain people or certain events. Some people have said maybe it's a ring of houses, and my shellfish garbage pile grows over to Brett, and so on and so forth, and then there's a manipulation of them. But regardless, these are really interesting because shell is made up of calcium carbonate. When that leaches into the ground, animal bones, things as small as fish scales, will preserve in the shell 5 feet away in dirt, are gone in 10 years. So 4,000 or 5,000 years later, we can find the bones of things people are taking out of nature, whether it's for food, for rope, for medicine, whatever the case may be. And there's 15 of these complexes in South Carolina. This one is on the north end of Edisto Island at the Botany Bay Heritage Preserve. So these are largely deposits of household garbage that are transported to these sites and then used as a building material. All right, about 3,000 years ago, we see Native Americans in the woodland period starting to stay in one place. And what has happened is they've become part-time gardeners. And those of you who garden know that you have got to protect the garden from the critters, from your neighbors. You got to be there. You can't leave it alone. There's a lot of work. And so when they start to garden, they start to build substantial houses and stay in villages in the woodland period. I forgot to tell you, in the late Archaic, Native Americans in South Carolina make the first clay pottery in the United States. It's called Stallings Island, an island in the Savannah River. They take clay, Spanish moss, and water and mix it together and make the first pots. Now, what that tells us is they're probably starting to cook starchy seeds. Okay. Now, my kids were really, when they were little, would call me up right as I drove in the driveway from my hour commute, said, can you go to the grocery store? I'm like, on your way home, I'm in the driveway. So if they said, get a bag of popcorn, I would get two. How come? I'm gonna eat one on the way home. I'm hungry. I was all ready to get a sandwich, right? If they say get a bag of brown rice, I only need one. How come? How long does it take to cook brown rice? Thank you. I get 1 minute sometimes in the microwave. It takes 45 minutes. You got to simmer it real slow. And those pots they're cooking starchy seeds. Okay, so they need those. Their diet has changed ever so slightly. About 1,000 years ago, we see a change, dramatic change on a lot of levels. We see large villages. We see mounds. The early explorers say the chiefs built their houses on top of these mounds. Probably other people built them. Sequestered away from the rest of the village. They go to full-time agriculture. Corn has finally been introduced. You know, a lot of people think, you know, corn agriculture was here a long time, but it's only about maybe 1,100 years old in South Carolina. I think in the eastern woodlands and the rich habitats that we have, it may not have been necessary. This idea starts out on the Mississippi River at a place called Cahokia, and it radiates all the way east. It's a new religion. It's worshiping the sun. The chiefs were the son of the sun, S-O-N-S-U-M, could control the weather, purported to control the weather. And if you think about agriculture, weather can be your enemy or weather can be your friend. You need solar radiation, you need sunlight, and you need lots of moisture, lots of rainfall. And the chief would come, sometimes they say would come out of his house in the morning and show his friend the sun how to go across the sky. You know, and I guess, you know, if the agricultural crop all of a sudden fails, and there was massive drought around 1450 in South Carolina, the power goes away. But this new way of life was large villages, palisaded, walls around them for defense, corn agriculture outside, very large structures, sometimes public buildings, places where the Progressive Network could have a school and a lot of people get together. Sometimes it's the jazz band playing here. You know, it's a place where a lot of people can gather for various kinds of events.
And whose settlement would that have been reflective
Oh,
of?
let me see if I can go back, please. This is now under the Richard B. Russell Dam and Lake on the Savannah River, excavated by archaeologists in the 1980s.
Like Thurman,
No, Richard B. Russell.
that's the dam.
Is it called Thurman now?
The lake.
The lake is.
Did they change the names? I call it Russell Dam. Sperm Thurman. This is a artist rendition of what the mounds would look like with structures on top of them, houses in the center. Lots of canoe travel is reported at that time. And then the invasion came of 1492. A lot of people don't like when I say invasion. What is an invasion of 1492? You know, most Americans don't know about this. You think you do. You learned a poem when you were a kid, right? I'm gonna say, don't just think in your head. So in 1495, Columbus comes over with the first beehive. That's not it. 1494, Columbus knocks on it, and it's not it. 1493, Columbus sails across the sea, right?
No.
What is it?
1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
In sing-song third grade cadence. Very good, everybody. What else do you know about it?
Brought civilization.
Name the ships. It's third grade cadence in an alphabetical order. Perfect. No one ever says Santa Maria first. But we don't know a lot about this. But it's an incredible event for Native Americans. Within about a decade or two, 25,000 Arawak-speaking Indians in the Caribbean would be dead. The Europeans had to come to South Carolina to find somebody to enslave. You were either already enslaved, Native American, or you were dead. And so they started to come to South Carolina to do that. There was a priest who documented the horrors that the Spanish were doing, Bartolomé de las Casas. Unfortunately, he was also the guy that said, maybe we should go to Africa and get slaves because the Indians are all gone. But he fought for better treatment of the Native Americans in the Caribbean. who were being, tied up, hung, tortured in the name of Christian religion. A lot of people don't know that Columbus had 4 voyages. And on the 3rd, he went home in chains, but he talked himself out of it when the charges when he got there and actually was able to come back. Pretty soon, the people in the Caribbean, they were already going down to Mexico and Peru, started, maybe let's go over to the Bahamas and get slaves. They go over there, they don't find anybody. So they come to the South Carolina coast instead. And they come up to what they call the River Jordan, which is the Santee River. And they go into Winyah Bay at Georgetown. Prince Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón settles in 1526. There was a 1521 exploratory expedition, another one in 1525. And then they establish a settlement somewhere on the south coast of South Carolina, the north coast of Georgia. We have not found that settlement. But within 2 years, it was over. Most of the people died. They died of disease, hardship at the hands of the Native Americans. And it's just a failure of an expedition. So from 1526 to 1539, there was no exploration into really the southeastern United States, into the interior anyway. Some of you have heard of Hernando de Soto. They named a car after him, and most southern towns have a hotel named De Soto. But Hernando de Soto led an expedition of 600 guys. They had native slaves carrying their gear. They had 100 pigs they picked up in Cuba. They had about 100 horses. They had 50 Irish wolfhounds trained to attack and kill humans. This large expedition came across the southeastern United States. They land in Tampa Bay in 1539. And they make their way up to Cofetacheki, which is, we think, Camden, South Carolina, having gone to these Mississippian villages where they're growing corn. They had to go to these towns where the people had stored lots of food in large storehouses to feed this incredible expedition. When they get to Camden, they're greeted by a female ruler. There's a female ruler who has this gigantic area, perhaps from Asheville, North Carolina to Charleston. Very, very large area that she's in charge of. This is a drawing from Florida, but she is carried on a litter down to the Watery River, put in a canoe and towed across the river where she meets De Soto. They stay for 6 days. They eat all the food, kidnap her. She's presented De Soto with strings of pearls. Up around Charlotte in the middle of the night, she escapes with the pearls she gave De Soto and his African-American slave. Another expedition, Juan Pardo, came out of a place called Santa Elena. This is down in Beaufort County, and those Penn Center people know about Santa Elena. Spanish town from 1566 to 1587, capital of Florida for the first 10 years. And Juan Pardo, the people in Santa Elena are starving, and the governor says, take the soldiers, go into the interior, find gold and silver, get out of here. I can't feed you. Go live off the land. Go live off the Indians in the interior. And so he comes up through Camden, Cofetacheki as well, but from a different angle, and then goes up into Morganton, North Carolina, where he builds a fort called San Juan. Colleagues of mine have found that fort and excavated it. There's one at Cofetacheki we have swung and missed and not found yet. So the Spanish are here, explore around, not very successful. The Santa Elena colony in 1587, Sir Francis Drake is attacking St. Augustine, and they move the garrison back down there for strength in numbers. And then Charleston in 1670. So for almost 100 years, there's no sustained European effort in South Carolina. And then we have the founding of Charleston. The French and the Spanish, before the British, did not trade guns to the Indians. The English did, and that changes everything, changes the whole social landscape. Henry Woodward, a trader, goes up to Cofetacheki to visit with the emperor. This is his description of it. A country so delicious and pleasant and fruitful, were cultivated, doubtless it would prove a second paradise. And he's advocating for the interior of South Carolina to be developed and populated with Europeans. The English do somehow managed to get a whole bunch of Indian chiefs to sign a document giving up about 10,000 acres of land. It's really interesting. There's 4 or 5 women chiefs who signed this document in 1675. The explorers would tell you that the men were in charge. Native American women will tell you today they're in charge, and they were back in the past too. And I believe. Soon, the #1 industry in South Carolina was the deer skin and the fur trade. People got incredibly wealthy off this. And you got to realize that parts of Europe were denuded of forest, denuded of the animals that lived in the forest. And they needed the leather, they needed the fur, they needed the resources of Carolina. So most of these are getting shipped off. And so the trade begins with Native Americans. And unfortunately, the traders willing to go into the Carolina backcountry were I should say, not undereducated, uneducated, illiterate scoundrels who cheated the Indians. And these Indians knew exactly what was going on. They knew when they were getting cheated. And so this, unfortunately, leads to a war. The trader, on Easter Sunday, 1715, the colonial officials and the governor and the colonial officials, they realized that the safety of the colony, the economy of the colony relied on peaceful relations with the Indians, but everybody under them did not get it. They send 3 traders up to a place called Pocatello in Beaufort County, Jasper County. And the idea is they're going to take the names of all the traders that have been ripping off the Indians, taking liberties with women, and come back to Charleston. They're going to call them in, put them before the court, and they're going to charge them because they don't want this happening. And so they go up there, and when the 3 traders go to bed, one is killed outright, one escapes, and one is tortured over a period of 3 days. They take fat lighter splints, hammer him into his body, and set him on fire. The Yamasee are a group of Indians from Florida who have just moved in the last 30 years to South Carolina. They get the name, but Indian groups across the eastern United States all get into this war. It's basically over within the first year, but it goes into 1717. And after that time, you know, if you went to Charleston prior to the Yamasee War after 1670, multicultural place. There's people from across Africa there. There's people from across Europe there, and there's people from multitude of Native American nations who are going there to trade. It would be like going to DC, and you have people from all over the world. They're there on diplomatic missions. They're there on economic, commerce and industry sort of things. And so after the Yamasee War, they don't want the Indians in the Low Country anymore. And so the battles take place, and then they don't want them in the Low Country. It's not a good thing. So they establish a series of forts in the interior. And the idea is 100 miles from the coast, Indians who have been pushed off the coastal plain will come to Augusta, Columbia, and up in the PD drainage to the 3 established forts. And then white people will bring the gear back down to Charleston. So Fort Congaree on the other side of the river here in KC was one of those. Only lasted for about 4 years. They set up the fort, and guess what happens next? Lots of people come moving in from Charleston who are white. You got a fort there for protection, and pretty soon people in the Deutsch Fork and all across the Midlands of South Carolina are run over. So you have these 3 trading forts, kind of strategically positioned where multiple Indian communities are located, so they can get to them. This is a watercolor by Philip von Reck. He came into the lower Savannah drainage in 1736, and he does a whole bunch of them, but I really like this one because it shows you within 60 years of the founding of Charleston, the acculturation. The lady on the left here has a European blanket. She's got a basket backpack. She's carrying a bow and arrow. She's got a little bit of European, a little bit of native. The guy in the middle has the trade gun. They made guns for the military, and they made guns to trade. The military gun was a really well-made one. And if it was today, the trade gun you would buy at Walmart. It's guaranteed to fall apart and you go get another. Pretty soon, all the Native Americans would have guns. We see a brief period where they're making their arrowheads out of the bottom of wine bottles. And then everybody has a trade gun. So he's got a backpack, he's got a European blanket, he's got a gourd that probably has his black powder for his firearm in it. And then the guy on the right has a European-made tobacco pipe. Pretty soon they're producing those cheaper than you could get anywhere else. And he's wearing silk stockings, which were for men then and now. And he's got like a raccoon bag. And so we see the acculturation pretty soon after this time period, though. Most bows and arrows were gone, and then they're just completely into the European mass-produced gear. Here's an encampment of deerskin in the deerskin trade. So they're hanging up the deer skins. The woman on underneath sitting down is working one on her lap. What do you see European in there? Iron kettles. Yeah. So the clay pots have gone away. Now, where were all the Indians going that going into the interior? Well, a lot of them went to the Catawba Nation. And you think of the Catawba Nation as the Catawba, but in the 18th century, it was a multicultural place. This is a map done by an Indian chief, we don't know his name, and was presented to Governor Nicholson of South Carolina in 1721. The chief of the Catawba lived at a place called Nassau, here in the center. And he is showing us his vision of the social landscape. And what you notice is that he is the center of the universe. And you have all these other towns. You have the Watery and the Chirral and the PD and all these groups, the Sugary. In order to go to Charleston or to Virginia, they have to go through his town. The powerful tribes, the Cherokees and the Chickasaw, can go around him to Charleston. So he's shown to the government, but these are all the folks that have been pushed off the low country. Yamasee and all these other groups coalescing for protection, strengthen numbers, and become the Catawba Nation over time. Now, a couple of things, and Robert probably talks about that in his lectures, but the Slave Code of 1740 was in response to slave uprisings. And one thing you got to remember, in 1715, at the time of the Yamasee War, you go to the Carolina Low Country and you meet 9 slaves, 3 of them are Native American. 1/3 of them are Native American. So the slave code applied to Negroes, Indians, mulattoes, mestizos, and these laws took away their culture. You go to a slave village before this, and it would look like an African village. After that, they're building European style housing, and you're not allowed to. And if you're born into slavery, then you're one of these. No singing on Saturdays and Sundays, no music, no carrying wooden swords, no drums, no horns, or other loud instruments. They're basically taking away their culture. And so it's also illegal for enslaved individuals to learn and read to write under the 1740 code. Governor Glenn, who's governor after the Yamasee War, it's a great quote. The concerns of the country are so closely connected and interwoven with Indian affairs, not only a great branch of our trade, but even the safety depends on a friendship with the Indians. So he was aware, but unfortunately not a lot of others were. The Catawbas in 1762 get 144,000 square acres. In 1840, they leave and go to North Carolina. It goes away. Jay Bender, who's perhaps going to be with us for the deep dive, was a lawyer that helped the Catawbas recover.
What year was the Catawba Nation established?
1762. So they're up there. Now, interesting, Native Americans in South Carolina have fought in every war since the Yamasee War, and just an incredibly proud military service to this day, which baffles me. A country that has been so rude and horrible to them, but they have served very proudly. We have a friend, Buster Hatcher, who's chief of the Waccamaw. He wears his Purple Heart on his hat. He got shot in camp playing his guitar in the foot, but that's another story. He also got shot a few more times. Now, Native Americans in South Carolina are trying to get federal recognition, and the Catawbas are the only ones that have it. The 13 state tribes do not. And the problem is the United States government erased them very early. You've heard of paper genocide? So from 1790 to 1840, Native Americans are not identified in the every 10-year census, which is really, really bad. And it's really not until 1890 that we see them, and then in 1900 that they're actually enumerated in the census. The government for recognition is saying, you got to tell us your history for 100 or more years. But we don't have it because our people are listed as mixed, mulatto, and never Indian in this time frame in the census, unfortunately. What have I done now? Go to. All right, thank you. This guy is not well liked in Indian country in South Carolina. We bought a piece of art at the Native American Studies Center a few years. It's got Andrew Jackson's face on a shooting target with bullet holes in it. Established in the midst of another and superior race. They wanted to move. This is a land grab. This is about land in Georgia. Settlers, white settlers in Georgia wanted the Cherokees land. It was productive, fertile. And so we have the Trail of Tears and Andrew Jackson to blame for that. Now, some semblance of Native American culture does still survive in pockets. The Catawbas, of course, have continuously made pottery over the last 4,000 years, going back to the late Archaic and the first Spanish moss, clay, and water potteries. And this is a photograph from 1909 showing Miss Brown coiling Catawba pottery. They still make me think it's a continuously practice folk art. This is a photograph by a famous photographer, Marion Post Wolcott, in 1938. This is in near Somerville. This is the Wassamasaw Native Americans, and this guy's descendant is Joshua Schumacher. He's the Native American coordinator for the South Carolina Commission for Minority Affairs, and he looks a lot like this guy.
Now, what year was that picture?
This picture is 1938. Now these are Chief Crummy of the Santee. He's deceased. Pete Parr of the PD, and that's Reverend John Creel of the Edisto, who I think you know. In 2021, there was a nice article in the state newspaper about them, often mistreated, undermined, regulated separate learning facilities where there was no place for them in the white or black schools. Now, you were part of the Freedom School. South Carolina had white and black schools, where a lot of people don't know there were Indian schools as well. Neither the blacks or the whites wanted the Indians in their schools, so they had a separate state-sponsored schools, and you can imagine that they were horribly underfunded. In 1811, this begins these free schools in all parts of South Carolina. Not enough money set aside for the schools. Finally, in 1895, there's tax support for these. And these go until, I believe, around 1970, the schools in South Carolina. Closed in 70. So this is the Leland Grove School, which was for PD and Lumbee Indians out in Dillon and Marlborough County. Girls on one side, boys on the other, 2 doors, separate facilities. The state of South Carolina, starting around 2001, began to come up with a plan to recognize the Native Americans in the state. This started with Jim Hodges, who was governor at the time, I believe the last Democratic governor in South Carolina. He's from Lancaster. To set up a system to recognize Native Americans, and this became law in 2005. And since that time, 8 tribes have been recognized. And you have to go through all kinds of information. You have to set up your family tree, your history, all your relations. You have to have 100 living descendants. You have to be organized for a long period of time and document traditions, customs, legends for that specific group's Indian heritage. Now, Robert mentioned I do oral history, and we were down in Sally in Orangeburg County with the Beaver Creek Indians, interviewing a bunch of people, and we see the chief, the council of elders, the artists, and we said, I don't know how to exactly say this, but the oldest person here that still kind of has their mental facilities about him would be a good interview. They said, we have a woman who's 90 years old. We're like, put her in the chair. She loves to talk. We're like, get her in the chair, put the camera on her, put a mic on her. Talk for about 40 minutes. And my colleague, Stephen Criswell, finally said, you haven't talked about your childhood. Let's finish up. Tell us what it's like growing up as an Indian in South Carolina. She said, honey, and you know something's coming when you do that. I didn't know I was an Indian until I was 80 years old. She told us the town she grew up in. It's all Indian then, it's all Indian now. She went to one of the state-sponsored Indian schools. Her family did not want her to identify as Native American. So she doesn't grow up with the tradition. She doesn't grow up speaking the language. The last speakers of the Catawba language died in 1962, having not taught their children or their grandchildren to do that. They want them to pass as white or black if you're dark and go to work in the textile mill where the Indians were not allowed to work. So we do have a series of Native American tribes that are scattered about the state. They're organized. They're trying to grasp everything about it. We're working with them with the Native American Studies Center in South Carolina. Recent president who came back. This is an old slide. Called Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas. Let's move on. I'm working with the group called Indigenize South Carolina. We're trying to change the curriculum in South Carolina K-12 education. And you can imagine how hard that's going to be at this present moment. And we've decided that there's no way we can change those curriculum standards. And so what we're going to do is we're going to develop websites with all that information. If the teachers want to find it, we're going to let them know it's there, but we're never going to change the curriculum. We tried 5 years ago to do it, had all these meetings, archaeologists, Native Americans, and it just didn't work. So we've taken this upon ourselves. There's Native people, there's educators. We've got ETV interested, folks from several colleges across the state. And if you want to know more about this, please let me know. Less than a month ago, Governor McMaster joined with the 8 state-recognized tribes. The guy in the hat on the far right holding up a document is Brian Harris, chief of the Catawba. They signed a document to work together. There's 8 sovereign nations. They want to work together. They want to be recognized. They want to be treated better than they have been. And they want to try to work together to get federal recognition. Right now, the Edisto have a bill introduced in Congress to become federally recognized. So do the Waccamaw, so do the PD, and so do the Waspanoag. There's 4 of them, 4 separate bills. I'm like, man, get a lobbyist, work all together. And it's just sitting there and they're worried. I'm like, you have to have somebody in Washington pushing this, getting it on agendas. And we're hoping that more of the tribes can become federally recognized. And it may be that they have to come together because a lot of them are cousins. All these different tribes are very much related. So what is the answer? What do they want? They want the same things that Modjeska said: jobs, peace, and equality. These are the things that they want. These are the things that they need. At the Native American Studies Center, where I work, we have 6 faculty. We have an artist, an archivist, an archaeologist, a historian, folklorist, and linguist working on South Carolina Native Americans. Our big mission is to dispel the stereotypes and the misconceptions about Native Americans. No, they don't live in teepees. No, they're not all dead. And try to revive their languages if we can, and try to help them put their documents. We can't do the federal recognition documents for them, but we can assist them with those. And with that, I'll take questions.
I hope we'll take questions.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Judge, I have a question about language.
Mr. Judge, call me Chris.
Okay, you mentioned languages just now, or can you give some examples of languages that are gaining traction and being brought back to life?
Yeah, there's so the 3 main language groups in South Carolina are Muskogee, Iroquois, and Catawba, which is a Siouan language. Okay, so the Yamasee are Muskogee speakers, the Cherokee are Iroquois speakers, and the Catawba speak Siouan. Those three languages are alive and well, but spoken and understood by very few people. One of the projects they're trying to do, what they're trying to do with the Catawbas, and we've worked with them, our linguist has, the Head Start kids get on a bus and go back to the reservation after school until their parents pick them up at 5. And they are teaching them the Catawba language by telling them the folk tales in both English and Catawba. And the hope is, you try to teach me a new language at this age will be very difficult. The sponges of the young kids probably be better. And so the Muskogee Nation that's not in South Carolina, Cherokee Nation that's in Oklahoma and Western North Carolina are working on that. And the Catawba are working to try to reestablish the language, but it's tough because there's no one fluent in it. At least in Catawba and Cherokee and Muskogee, there are. Other questions?
Questions here?
I have a question. Let's very briefly touch two things. The extent and the impact of the Yamasee War, and then mentioning briefly the Maroons. Those are two things we want to talk about a little bit in this era.
Maroons?
And that
Okay.
the Yamasees, I'll go ahead and say that what I've been just fascinated by that I didn't know that the Cherokees have their language in their newspaper during the Yamasee War.
I believe they did, yeah.
Yeah, and that I didn't know that the.
No. They
Was
didn't
it
have a
later
language
than
until
that?
1830. Sorry.
Okay, but that I didn't know that this Yamasee War was organized all the way to the Mississippi River. And that this, what I read it's in your reading was that this came real close to terminating colonial development at that point. I mean, they would have come back,
Yeah.
but they almost lost.
If you read Walter Edgar's History of South Carolina, he says something to the effect that the Enterprise at Charleston, the colony, was never under the greatest threat as it was on the eve of the Yamasee War. But the Yamasee War was a major failure for the Indians. The prisoners of war were sent into slavery in the Caribbean. They got sent to the sugar plantations where they couldn't run home. There was a lot of them killed. The Yamasee are pushed out of South Carolina. They had come from St. Augustine in 1684. They go back there. What was the second part of the question?
Maroons.
So with the Maroons, one thing to think about with that is the next few weeks as we talk about African slavery in South Carolina, we'll talk about the Maroons. But one thing about Maroons that's worth noting is that when we think about escaping from slavery, we tend to think about people taking the Underground Railroad up north, that sort of thing. But there's a much longer history of what we call Maroons or Maroon communities. Enslaved Africans who escaped from their plantations where they were and would escape into the hinterland. Say here in South Carolina, it would escape to Congaree Swamp.
Or the Falls Swamp at Ridgeville.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
It may have had Indians as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Enslaved
people.
Right. And so we're going to be talking more about the Maroons in weeks to come, including in some ways that you may be surprised to learn about. I saw we had a question from Queen Quet. Go right ahead, please. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good evening, everybody. Glad for day one more again. The show the Queen Quet, head from the body of the Gullah Geechee Nation from St. Helena Island, South Kakalaki. So peace and blessings to everybody over there at Penn, down the road. My question, I'm very curious about this process of documentation for recognition and the statement that was made by the presenter of there needing to be 100 descendants, and then also documenting all of the different cultural aspects of their communities or their lifestyles over the years. My question is about who then possesses that material, who has all levels of ownership, the intellectual property rights, the trademark, the copyright, the everything to all of that, because it sounds to me like the usual thing that people have done with indigenous folks, as I have indigenous ancestry and Gullah Geechee ancestry, to us. Document it, we take it, and then we interpret it and museumize you in a way that's really not your culture, but a way that's more palatable to America. So who ultimately owns all of this stuff once you document it? Because it sounds like it gets submitted to possibly the state and the federal governments for that recognition process. I'm real curious about it.
The recognition for the state goes to the Commission for Minority Affairs. I'm not sure where to look at the camera.
Okay.
It goes to the Commission for Minority Affairs.
Okay.
They have to put these large documents together. They are housed at the Commission for Minority Affairs, which is out off of Greystone Boulevard here.
Yes.
They're also housed at the Department of Archives and History in their long-term archival storage spaces. The information is owned by the tribe. Should be owned by the tribe. So they have copies of it, the commission does, and the archives does. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. Thank you. And it's just what I thought it was, but I wanted to confirm that's what was happening. All right. Thank you.
At the federal level, it's with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is part of the Department of Interior.
Right. Thanks.
Good to see you.
I just have a comment. I applaud and appreciate the presentation and the information that you gave. I'm 65 years old,
Me too.
grew up watching the Westerns on television and that sort of thing and saying, I wonder how they knew how to get from point A to point B, you know, and some of the skirmishes that they did. What you just showed is the people that pre-existed before the Westerns that we see.
Yeah.
They were mobile. They were
Yep.
engaged in the environment.
Yep.
And knew how to get to point from point A to
They
point
were
B.
trading.
Yeah.
Yeah,
just-
they had intimate knowledge of their territories. They had
Yeah.
developed paths.
yeah.
You know, those paths became the early roads in South Carolina.
Maybe they were too good.
Yeah. So, you know, if you think about Highway 17 and different roads in South Carolina, they probably started out as Indian paths.
Yeah. And the other thing is women can be the leaders of a nation. I just.
And I'm fairly confident in saying that there was no construction on those roads back then the way there is right now with Malfunction Junction. But
Yeah.
I digress. Okay, Thomas, and then we've got folks at Sumter as well. Go ahead, please.
I don't know, this may actually be a little bit outside of the South Carolina focus, but I've always wondered, why is it that south of the border is so much more indigenous than the United States and Canada? I mean, they still had colonial
South of the
occupation.
Gulf of Mexico, do you mean?
Yeah, like south of Mexico,
Yeah.
Central America, and South America. Like, why is that so, why are their populations, or at least to like my eyes, my.
You know,
understanding-
they're very different cultures. You know, I teach a course called North American Prehistory. And below the Rio Grande is not part of it. It's just the US and Canada. People who track languages think there were 3 migrations, and the first one goes down there. The second one is the continental US, and the third one is the Arctic Circle. And so it may be that they start as different populations, but there are connections. But you're right, you know, some of those societies like the Inca and the Maya are state level. They're like the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians. We don't think the Mississippians got to a state level of society. We call it a chieftain, but they're almost there. So there's a major difference. I don't know if I can answer that question.
No, that's fine.
Um,
Yeah,
But it's a good observation for sure.
Right.
There's definitely something going on.
I mean, because it seems like there was just as much colonial violence
Oh, there was.
in Latin
Oh, yeah,
America.
even earlier.
I mean, otherwise they wouldn't be speaking Spanish.
Well, and I think to answer your question partly is that there's a difference in how the English approached indigenous peoples versus the Spanish in terms of how the English were much more, well, they built a different racialized system in North America versus what the Spanish bring in Central America, Mexico, and South America. So that plays a role too.
Yeah. The Spanish wanted them to become subjects of the king and become Catholics. And the British didn't really care.
All right, Sumter, your hand is raised. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, hi, my name is Toshiba, and I kind of wanted to piggyback off of the Queen's question in reference to who determined the criteria that was necessary for determining what makes a tribe a legitimate tribe, and how was it determined, and were any of the members of the tribe included in that determination of the criteria necessary to be determined a legitimate tribe?
You go, girl.
Thank you for that question. The recognition team is the head of the Commission for Minority Affairs, the state archaeologist, and the chiefs of the tribes that are already recognized determine who is an Indian. And so that process is codified into the South Carolina law, and they follow that. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a cultural expert outside of South Carolina that also serves on what they call the recognition committee. I could get to you guys the links to those laws so people can look at them in detail. Does that answer your question, Sumter?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Professor Judge, would it be a fair assessment that there are peoples that are trying to organize a tribe that aren't really welcomed by the tribes that are already organized? I'm
Yes.
hearing that.
Yes, there is. There's
It's a human problem.
yeah, I mean, if you all of a sudden pop up, they're wondering who you are and why you're interested. So like right now, a lot of people want to get on the Catawba roll. Anybody want to venture an answer to that?
The North Carolina Catawba's got federal recognition recently, right? Or at least.
What was the reason for the?
Casinos.
The casino. Yeah, they smell money. And so there's a lot of people trying to do that. But if you're not on the rolls from a long, long time ago, it's very difficult. Very difficult. Yeah.
Or are the 8 nations that were requesting recognition having land in this moment, or?
Oh, good question.
I mean, I feel, and maybe I'm wrong, that the obstacles for recognition are linked to denying land property.
Yeah. One of the problems is you're supposed to have land. The federal recognition
We're on it.
wants you to be on that land. We are on it. And so they have purchased land that may or may not be within their traditional grounds. The Catawbas have had land for over 200 years. And so land is part of it. And when you agree to become state recognized, you also agree to never have a casino.
Why? Why?
South Carolina government, Ernie, has not wanted to even meet with the natives. The past governors have said, you can come meet. If you start talking about gambling, the meeting's over.
Wow.
Now, you think about it, the Catawbas got 2 high-stake bingo licenses in the settlement in 1990. What else was going on? Video poker. And then the lottery came along. They stood to become the only game in town, and all of a sudden, so I think there's a turf war in the funds that could be raised. Now, it's taxed. Well, they could tax the gaming money, but they have not wanted to do that. So that's been a stickler. And if you look around native groups around the country, that's one of the ways that they can make money. Some are becoming hemp farmers, some are opening dispensaries and things like that to try to get. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck with the class.
One last question, I don't think you.
If they obtain recognition, they obtain the right to rule themselves by the Indian law, or do they have to follow the federal and?
State recognition gets you absolutely nothing except a plaque. Federal recognition, well, you used to be eligible for social programs from the federal government. Alcohol and drug abuse, housing, schools, you're entitled to all those kind of things. The land that you have is held in trust by the US government, but you are a sovereign nation. So the Catawba have their own police. The boundaries of that is a sovereign nation. When those kids go to public schools, the public school charges the nation for it to go to school.
So people on Zoom and people in this room, Professor Judge will be back this coming Sunday from 4 to 6 with a deeper dive into this history.
All right.
Thanks,
you very
everybody.
much.
Appreciate it.
And I do also want to point out, there is a wonderful book that just came out called Dark Laboratory, which is about the relationship between Christopher Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic Ocean and climate change. And the argument basically is that the phenomenon of climate change, as we've observed over the last several hundred years, is heavily linked to European colonization of the Americas. So that book just came out about 2 weeks ago. It's called Dark Laboratory. Definitely worth checking out. So I am here this evening, the time we have left, to talk a bit about the history of Africa. Now, again, Dr. Bernie Gallman will be doing a wonderful series on African history starting on the 16th of March. Those are Sunday evenings at 6:30. I would highly recommend checking those out if you have time, because they are wonderful lectures and conversations about African history. But what I'm doing this evening is giving a very brief snapshot of history in West Africa in particular on the eve of the slave trade. And the main reason we're doing this is that it's important for folks to recognize that African history, Black history, does not begin with slavery, that there is a long history of African peoples before European colonization, before European slavery. That is also very important to understand when you're talking about the settlement of Carolina and the creation of what is now the United States. So we're going to go ahead and jump into that right now. and my hope is to leave some time for questions. But there is also a second reason why I think this particular lesson is very important. And I want to just share my screen really quickly and show you a cover of an issue of Ebony magazine from 1976. This is August of 1976. It's Africa, Continent of the Future. Now, this is almost 50 years ago now, but if you keep up with current affairs, which we all know how fun that is these days, but if you keep up with current affairs, especially with foreign relations, then you'll understand that the continent of Africa has quickly become an important battleground amongst the world's great powers. And so this lesson is not just about the past, it's also about the present and the future, because if you don't know much about Africa now, you will in the next 5 to 10 years. And you know the old saying about Americans and maps, we learn geography thanks to warfare. So hopefully that will not be the case with Africa anytime soon, but you never know. So I often like to emphasize the histories of West African kingdoms especially, right? Because the vast majority of peoples of African descent in the US can trace their heritage to West Africa or Southwest Africa. Now, the thing about some of these kingdoms is that they cover the gamut of different kinds of empires and civilizations, such as the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Jolof Empire. Now, we're not going to go into heavy detail with all these empires this evening, but the most important thing to note is, number one, most West African empires, tribes, and civilizations, when they're focused on trade, diplomacy, and commerce, their vision is often looking inward towards the interior of Africa, as opposed to looking out toward the Atlantic Ocean. That'll become important in a moment. But in addition to that, these kingdoms, like the indigenous groups that Professor Judge just mentioned, had their own religions, their own languages, their own customs, their own traditions, really things that set them apart from other kingdoms in Africa. It's also worth noting that when we're talking about the continent of Africa, we're not talking about one homogeneous people. Far from it. We're talking about dozens, if not hundreds, of ethnicities, languages, customs, religions, and so forth. I like using this map because it gives you a sense of just a taste of some of the empires that are throughout the continent of Africa. You have Ethiopia in the east, Kush, classical Egypt, but we're focused primarily on Western Africa. Songhai Empire, you see right here, or the Ghana and Mali empires here further to their west. Again, these are just some of the empires that helped to shape history in West Africa, a rich history that, again, Dr. Gallman will be getting more detail with in the weeks and months to come. Now, my students at Claflin, I think, by this point in the semester have already grown tired of the fact that I always talk about trade in my history courses, especially in my survey of world history classes. But as you can see here from the map of the Ghana Empire, trade was a very important part of how they maintained control in West Africa. Again, you can see some of the trade routes are going up north to Morocco, or going into the interior of Africa, or going south as well. And one thing about these trade routes that you want to keep in mind is that many of these African empires were at least somewhat aware of other civilizations in other parts of the continent of Africa. They're conducting trade all over the place. This is really important to their income. And what's going to happen is that as European powers begin to explore the coastline of Africa, they also become part of these trade networks as well. So that's going to play a major role in how these civilizations develop over time. Now, if you're wondering what they're trading a variety of products, including salt. Gold becomes an important part of trade in West Africa, and also enslaved people. We'll come back to in a second. Now, this is an artist's painting of Sundiata Keita, who was the founder of the Mali Empire. And the thing about Sundiata is that he is at the center of one of the great African epics, the Epic of Sundiata, which is sort of their answer to the Iliad or the Odyssey or other mythic stories from Europe and around the world. Also, if you have seen the film The Lion King, you have seen a version of the Sundiata epic as well, because it kind of matches some of those same story themes too. You also have roughly 800 years ago, the Mali Empire in West Africa as well, including the cities of Timbuktu and Gao. And I like mentioning the Mali Empire because of one of their rulers, who was Mansa Musa or Musa the First. Now, if you spend any time on social media, which is often a mistake, but if you do, chances are you may have come across TikTok videos or Instagram reels about Musa the First of Mali, who some historians have argued was, in his time, one of the wealthiest men in the world. And that's because of what he is holding in his hand there, a big old piece of gold. Now, Musa the First was so wealthy that when he and his royal entourage made the pilgrimage to Mecca around 1324, by this point, many of the ruling class in the Mali Empire were actually Muslim. When he made his trek across North Africa to Mecca in 1324, along the route, he passed out pieces of gold to people that he saw on the street. So you see somebody on the road, you say, oh, here's a piece of gold. It's a blessing unto you and your family. Now, again, the Mali Empire was built in large part on having ready access to large gold mines nearby. So, I mean, this sounds pretty cool in theory, right? I mean, if tomorrow you walked out to Main Street in Columbia and somebody was handing out $100 bills, you'd be like, I am not going to ask any questions. Thank you very much. Only one small problem with that. When he made his return trip to the Mali Empire the following year, in 1325, he discovered, to his astonishment, that he gave out so many pieces of gold that he caused inflation in North Africa and the Mediterranean economy. So this is affecting areas like Sicily, parts of Italy, Spain, not just North Africa. So he has to basically give out trinkets and gifts and other things to get the gold back and to stabilize the Mediterranean economy. This is, again, how important Musa the First of Mali actually was. Again, you just think about how much damage one man can do to the economy. Not that we know anything about that these days, but I digress. All right. And then there's the Songhai Empire. Again, the Mali and the Songhai empires, they don't quite coincide with one another. The Songhai comes into control after the fall of the Mali Empire. For both empires, one of the key stories that's worth noting is the importance of the environment to their empires, especially in terms of concerns about famine and weather really playing a role in the fall of the Mali Empire, and how the Songhai Empire had some of those same issues as well. And you notice that the Songhai Empire is making very sure to stay close to rivers like the Niger River to control those trade routes throughout West Africa. Again, as I said before, for both the Mali and the Songhai Empire, their concern is much more with trade into the interior of Africa. Again, let me go back to this image real quick. So if you see this image, keep in mind that it's actually part of a much larger map. Those lines you see there are all trade routes throughout North and West Africa. And the maps this is from the Catalan map, a Catalan atlas from like 1355 or so, the 14th century certainly. And the map again shows this rich detail of oasis cities, of trading posts, of university towns, all throughout North and West Africa. So what's clear is that scholars in Spain and Portugal, at least, understood that there was a lot going on in West Africa in the 14th century, much of which was just beyond the purview of most Europeans. And again, this is another example of a trade map you see here. You see the Empire of Mali off to the west, Again, they're trading through the heart of Africa to places as far north as Marrakesh and Morocco, or Egypt or Ethiopia. And again, I could go into much more detail with this, but Dr. Galvin will talk about all these empires in his lectures in the weeks to come. But also, West Africa was a center of learning as well. I often enjoy telling my students about the greatness of the city of Timbuktu, which I have to admit, as a child who grew up on Looney Tunes, I heard of Timbuktu was sort of the butt of a joke. But it was actually a center of great learning for African scholars for centuries. In fact, one of the great tragedies is that in recent years, some of the universities and some of the repositories of documents in Timbuktu have been destroyed by terrorism. So some of that knowledge has been lost forever. And this is one last map of West Africa. Again, what I want to emphasize here is that all these various empires and civilizations were conducting trade and diplomacy. They were also very much emphasizing education and the arts. These are societies that in world history especially often get glossed over, but we have to recognize how important they are, because by the time Europeans begin conducting extensive exploration of the West African coast, the Europeans are having to come to West Africa initially with respect for the civilizations that are there. Now, again, just to give you some quick information about how all these kingdoms are like. Number one, all of them were heavily dependent on gold. Again, they have access to gold mines. They're able to have some outsized influence on the Mediterranean economy. And so this provides a good bit of their power and prestige. Islam was an important part of all these empires. That is important when we talk about why African slavery really takes off. We'll come back to that point in a second. And also, they're often emphasizing trade to the interior of Africa using both land and river-based routes. I think sometimes folks ask the question, if these empires were so great, why weren't they sending ships across the Atlantic to explore? The answer is very simple. They have no reason to. There was no reason for them to do that. If you're doing trade with the interior of your continent, then you're thinking, well, we're pretty much set. We're good to go. The European powers like Spain and Portugal, who begin exploring in the 15th century, they have reason to do so. They're trying to recover from the Reconquista. They're trying to build up their economies during an age of constant warfare. And so they're having to try to find new routes for trade and diplomacy wherever they can find them. Which brings me to the Congo Kingdom, which is in Southwest Africa, an area of Angola today. I like to tell this story because it shifts our ideas and thinking about the interactions between Europeans and Africans in a very different light. I think for most of us now, when we think of the continent of Africa, the first thing we think of are the images we get in the here and now that tend to emphasize things like government corruption, poverty, warfare, strife, and so forth. But the funny thing about history is that if you go back a few centuries, the continent of Africa, especially places like the Congo Kingdom, look a bit different in the eyes of Europeans, especially the Portuguese, who first encountered the Congo Kingdom in the 1470s. And then again, this gives you a sense of where that kingdom is and vis-a-vis a current map of Africa. Again, a good bit of Angola and that part of Southwest Africa. Now, when the Portuguese first began trade and relations with the Congo Kingdom in the 1470s, Portugal by this point is the first European power to really try to explore the Atlantic Ocean, to explore into the Indian Ocean. And while the Portuguese are trying to find a sea route to India and China, they happen to also begin exploring the coastline of Africa. And this leads them to encounters with the Congo Kingdom and other West African civilizations. Now, one thing that I always point out to my students here is that you see that the sailors, the Portuguese men, are approaching the Congo king with not really out of a sense of domination, but they're trying to say, hey, we want to conduct diplomacy with you. We're treating you as equals. You don't want to start thinking yet about Europeans going into Africa and conquering everything via imperialism. That's a long process. In the beginning, though, this is very much a relationship where the Portuguese realize that the Congo Kingdom has a great deal to offer them. And in exchange, the Congo Kingdom recognizes we could conduct some good diplomacy and trade with these strange fellows from Europe. Now, this is what's going to lead to Portugal conducting a large number of expeditions around the coast of Africa. And all the little green dots you see on the map here are either forts set up by the Portuguese or areas where they come into contact with peoples on the coastlines of Africa. And as you can see here, they are conducting extensive exploration into the Atlantic Ocean. They're going around the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually also making contact with East Africans as well. And it's worth noting, for those who are interested in East African history, the East Africans are already involved in trade networks across the Indian Ocean. So they're trading for products that are as far east as India and even China, right? So again, when we think about global history, if you shift the lens away from Europe, it actually gets more interesting in some ways. But the Portuguese are desperate to make new trade relationships and new diplomatic relationships with peoples throughout the old world. This is a map the Portuguese made around 1563. And you notice this, that the European part is just the Iberian Peninsula, but then Africa has all this rich detail. And this is because for Portugal, as we get into the 16th and 17th centuries, for them, while they're sending ships to Brazil and they're exploring Brazil and places like that, for the Portuguese, West Africa becomes a key part of their foreign policy. And in fact, becomes the heart of their foreign policy for those 2 centuries. The Portuguese become heavily reliant on trade with various kingdoms in Africa, and vice versa. Many of those kingdoms in Africa begin to see Portugal as a good trading partner. For example, the king of Congo Kingdom converts to Catholicism as a sign of respect for the Portuguese people and their religious faith. Now, why Portugal, right? Unfortunately, this will be the first and probably last time I talk about Portugal in this class. But Portugal often gets forgotten about in that age of European exploration. They're the ones who really kick everything off. But why Portugal? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, in the 14th century, the Black Death, bubonic plague, hits Europe, wipes out between a third to a half of Europe's population. Because Portugal is at the very edge of the European continent, they were the last to be hit by the Black Death, so it wasn't as harsh on them as it was on, say, folks in what is now Germany, France, or Italy. Also, because of their geographic isolation, the Portuguese could create a strong national identity. This helped them build up the kind of government you needed to have to conduct diplomacy and trade thousands of miles away. Also, their trade with the Muslims in Spain and North Africa gave them a leg up on technology because the Muslims in the Mediterranean had advanced naval technology, far beyond anything most European nations had in the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, the Portuguese, because they're the first Europeans to conduct extensive diplomacy and trade with West Africa, they're really the first ones to start talking about, well, how does West Africa look to us? This is actually a painting of the city of Benin on the West African coast from 1686. And what we know is that many Portuguese sailors and diplomats alike agreed that, to them at least, cities in West Africa were as impressive as those in Europe. There was no difference in cultures or technologies. Now, there were differences in culture, certainly, but there was not a sense of Portuguese culture being superior to that of African culture. In large part because, again, Portuguese culture has some similarities with these kingdoms in West Africa, such as ideas about mysticism, witchcraft, that for the Portuguese folded in nicely with their Catholicism as well. Now, this image I'm about to show you is one of my favorite from world history. This gentleman here is Dom Miguel de Castro, who was the Congo Kingdom's ambassador to the Dutch Republic in 1643. Right. This is I would have to say, a very well-dressed gentleman here. I can't pull off the hat, I don't think, but otherwise, I think I could pull off that look. But I emphasize this image because when we think about Africa and Europe, right, we don't think about images like this, where African ambassadors and diplomats are being received in the courts of Western Europe. But there's a major reason for this that Professor Judge just alluded to a moment ago. For European powers like Spain, Portugal, France, Britain to colonize what they refer to as the New World, they're going to need a constant labor supply. Initially, for those powers, that labor supply was found here in the Americas, the indigenous peoples. However, for a variety of reasons, overwork, warfare, and perhaps most importantly, disease, much of that labor population is wiped out. So Europeans need another labor supply. It's not going to be other Europeans. The thing is, most Europeans are not going to take that voyage across the Atlantic. So there is one other source, and I'm glad Professor Judge mentioned this. I don't want to blame, I don't want to blame our friend here about the beginnings of the African slave trade, but there are reasons for why African labor becomes so useful for them. For one thing, I mentioned earlier, the Europeans, when they start trading with the Africans, they are entering into already existing trade networks. And the Portuguese in the 15th century, when they're trading with, say, the Congo Kingdom, one of the, I hate to say this, but one of the items they're receiving are enslaved people. The Congo Kingdom, other West African empires are saying, well, by the way, we have enslaved laborers. Do you want some of these for work back home or on the islands we're colonizing? The Portuguese are saying yes. This starts to grow and grow and grow. Another reason for African labor is that most of the Africans, virtually all of them, practice religions other than Christianity. For many European nations, there were laws that were that expressly forbade Christians being enslaved and used as enslaved labor. Now, before you ask, because I know I always get this question, well, don't the Africans in the Americas become Christians? Yes, we'll get to that in the weeks to come. But in this era, in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the argument is that the Africans are not Christian. Therefore, it is perfectly fine to enslave them. In fact, many of the early Africans brought to, say, South Carolina are actually practitioners of the Muslim faith, which is something that we have seen documented in countless places. Also, many of the enslaved Africans, unlike their indigenous counterparts, have built up immunities to diseases like smallpox, etc., that they're used to being in the so-called old world. So all these factors play a role in why Africans are used as enslaved labor, right? This is an image that was from the 17th century or so, showing indigenous peoples dying from smallpox. Again, disease is a critical factor in both the massive decline of the indigenous population and the rise in the use of African labor during this time period. Now, a good bit of the first few classes of the Modjeska Simkins School will deal with slavery in South Carolina. But to give you some background for how this transatlantic slave trade begins, you want to start in the early 16th century, so-called First Atlantic System of Slavery. Now, it begins around 1502, and it lasts until 1580. And what makes this system a bit different is that it's very haphazard. It largely only involves the Spanish and the Portuguese. And this is about 3% total number of slaves who were being transported across the Atlantic Ocean during the several hundred years of the Atlantic slave trade. And to give you a sense of what this system looked like, again, it's involving primarily Spain and Portugal. The Portuguese are trading directly with African kingdoms for slaves, whereas the Spanish are trading with intermediaries to get their hands on the slave labor as well. This plays a pivotal role in the growth of both the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas in the 16th century. Now, as a historian, I always love to give students tools to do further exploring on their own of some of these topics. And one website I want to feature right now, and I'll put this in the chat as well, is a map of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, this map was based off of years of research by historians and others who were trying to find out just how extensive the slave trade was. And I want to just let this map kind of show you what I'm talking about here. Now, each dot on the map you see here is an individual ship involved in the slave trade. And for some of the dots, we have limited or no information. But for other dots, we have the crew manifest, how many slaves were on board, etc. So I'm going to pause it at 1619. Right? I think that's the year most of us recognize. It's sometimes seen as the year that's the beginning of the African-American experience, the first enslaved people arriving in the colony of Virginia in 1619. Although, as Professor Judge just mentioned, you already have enslaved Africans in North America well before that, who were part of the Spanish expeditions into the interior, etc. Again, there was a book that I learned about as a kid called Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. And as a child, I always thought, what do you mean before the Mayflower? It doesn't make any sense. And yet what he was talking about was enslaved Africans being part of Spanish colonization of the New World. And if you look at this map, right, so I'm going to click on a dot here. Okay, we know the name of that ship. Now, here's one that we have from Portugal. The ship made 2 journeys between 1618 and 1622 and transported a total of 587 Africans, right? This is the kind of detail historians were able to get out of years, not decades, in archives throughout the Atlantic world, in Europe, the Americas, and Africa itself. But what I also want to illustrate here is how this slave trade accelerates over time. Oh, just wait. Just wait. Now, by the way, you notice where are most of the dots going? South America, right? South America, the Caribbean, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind when talking about the extent of the transatlantic slave trade. How much of it is going to Brazil in particular, to the Caribbean? The most valuable piece of real estate by the 18th century in all of the Western Hemisphere is Saint Domingue, Haiti. A small island you see here. We'll be talking more about them in a couple of weeks. But this area it's very small, but it was basically a massive sugar plantation that the French utilized and with brutal effect for decades. Now you see more and more ships starting to go across the Atlantic. You want to keep in mind that, again, this is part of a much larger transatlantic economic system where you have raw materials being shipped out of the Americas to Europe to create finished products. Many of those products are being sent to Africa in exchange for enslaved labor that then goes across the Atlantic, and the process continues. And again, you're seeing how this system of slavery is becoming more and more integral to the building up of the New World.
Can stop anytime.
Well, I got a year in mind I want to stop it at.
Oh my God.
And again, I think if you recognize that each dot represents several hundred people. And again, and those ships could have been poets, doctors, philosophers, teachers who were all ripped away from their homes.
And a third of them died on the way too.
Right. And I want to stop in the year 1776. And you see again how intense. Now this is interesting. This is a ship from Denmark, right? We all think of slavery and the European slavery as involving Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and that's it. But you have ships from Denmark, from Sweden, who are also involved with the slave trade. You see that this ship made 12 journeys between 1724 and 1786 with a total of 3,832 Africans, right? This is the year of American independence, 1776, and you see how the system of slavery continues to develop over time. And again, keep in mind, this is as the abolitionist movement is beginning to gain ground in both America and Britain, and yet the system of slavery is becoming more and more intensified. Okay. Okay, so I actually want to pause it there and open up the floor for questions. Are there any questions at all? Yes.
Do you know much about the African slave trade going towards the east? Because I only know one example of this, and this is probably a very reckless term to use, but a group of people in Iran called the Black Persians, who were brought there by Arab slave traders. And they kind of exist as this, minority within Iran that, have very minimal recognition and people mostly just kind of ignore. Is it comparable at all, or was it pretty much all going well?
Well, let me show you a map. I love maps. So there is an East African slave trade as well. Let me just show this really quickly. And this slave trade also involves several million people. In this case, it's going to what is now referred to as the Middle East, but also going as far east, as you can see here, as India. So in fact, you can find even today people who can trace their ancestry back to Africa because of this East African slave trade. Now, keep in mind, this is happening concurrently with the transatlantic slave trade. So between these two slave trades, there are tens of millions of Africans being drawn out of Africa to other parts of the world for slave labor. That answer your question?
Yeah. I was just curious because and none of this is to try and absolve us of our crimes. But I don't know. It's just going back to what you were saying before about, when you move away from Europe, the history becomes a lot more interesting. I don't know. I just remember reading a story about the Black Persians and how it's just this group of people that just sort of exist there in Iran now, and they're all very, very dark skinned, and they don't quite know their history, except they know that genetically they're tied to Africa.
Right, absolutely. And there are also questions that have been raised about, again, tying back to today's lecture, about the beginnings of what we refer to as racism. In this case, anti-Black racism. And historians have argued about this for decades now, because on the one hand, we see the ideas of anti-Black racism as a relatively recent phenomenon. On the other hand, we have quotes from, say, Muslim rulers out of North Africa, where they're referring to Black Africans as inferior, etc., in the 14th century. So these are the kinds of questions that historians are still grappling with now in terms of not only how do we teach this stuff, but how do we define some of these terms like race, racism, and so forth? Any other questions? Yes, go ahead, please.
You said when the Portuguese first start trading in West Africa, the slave trading was already kind of existent.
Yes.
One of the was it largely all exportation at that point, or was there trading of humans at that point that were also on the continent of Africa? Does that make sense?
Right. No. So what we're talking about here is that by the time the Portuguese enter trade with, say, the Congo Kingdom is already trading enslaved Africans throughout their part of Africa.
Okay.
Now, here's the thing, though, and I hate to do this, but I'll preface this by saying that slavery has been part of the human experience from the beginning of recorded history. And the slavery that we know of in Africa at this time was a bit different. Now, the enslaved were often people who were prisoners of war, that sort of thing. Now, because the slave trade becomes so lucrative for these kingdoms, and they start trading with Europeans, more and more enslaved people, it causes more wars in Southwest Africa. And it's not until the 18th century where some of these African rulers are saying, oh my God, we made a terrible mistake. What are we doing? But by then it's too late. They're too firmly entrenched in that system of slavery. Also, it's worth noting that based on what we know, that the system of slavery in the interior of Africa was a bit different. In some cases, the slavery was not your entire life. It's like a certain number of years. In other cases, the enslaved may be allowed to marry into the family and gain their free status that way. But what we're seeing with chattel slavery in the New World is very different. It's a slave system that lasts for your entire life. Yes.
Dr. Green, maybe you'll be talking about this in upcoming lectures, but the infrastructure that was created in Africa to keep this going, right? Was that imported from Europe or from the exporters from Europe, or was it there existing so that, you know what I'm saying? I mean, there has to be an infrastructure to find people, to get them prepped, to put them on a ship, to bring them back. I mean, that's an enterprise.
That's what I was about to ask. Like, who were these people and what put them in that situation? Were they snatching people up, you know? Are they like, you know, prisoners, or like you said, a war? Like, where did all these people end up in this position?
Well, it's a combination of both Europeans and Africans. Again, I want to go back to this map for a second. You see some of the ports here, like Elmina in particular and others. These are set up by the Portuguese, other European nations to conduct basically trade with the interior of Africa. So that's the European side of things. But it's often African kingdoms themselves who are capturing other Africans. And I remind students of this too. This is important to note right now. My first year at Claflin, a student asked me, how could they capture their brothers and sisters and put them into slavery? And I said, very simple. They weren't their brothers and sisters. You know, there were other tribes, other kingdoms, other empires. It wasn't a thing that they thought of as, oh, this is somebody I'm related to. It's more of, they're just an enemy tribe, sucks to be them. But the thing is though, as this goes on, initially, when the Portuguese are doing all this exploring, the enslaved are only a small part of what's being traded. But by the 16th century and the 17th century, this explodes, and it helps to create conflicts within Africa itself, because these tribes are trying to get more finished products from Europe to trade for those who need more enslaved people to trade. And so it becomes a deadly cycle of violence and warfare that, again, as early as the 16th century, some African monarchs were saying, this is a bad idea. What are we doing? But the trade for guns, for clothing, etc., is just too lucrative to ignore. And if they do ignore it, then they risk being overwhelmed by other empires that don't ignore it. So it's all a vicious cycle that we're talking about.
Like learning more about who these, you know, different groups of people and the different like areas are, and kind of like history of any of that?
That can be arranged.
That's also Dr. Gallman.
Yeah, and Dr. Gallman's lectures, I think, go into further detail as well. Keep in mind, this is a very brief survey of a large history. All right, I see, I'll come back to the room in a second. I see Keith's hand is up on Zoom.
Well, expanding on the previous point about the increased internal warfare in Africa, do you speculate that made the continent, the countries in Africa, more susceptible to being conquered by the Europeans?
You know, that is an interesting question. I would simply say I would lean toward no for one reason. Most of the European conquest of Africa that we think of happens a bit later in the 19th century. And that's due to a number of factors. Number one, technology that the Europeans have. Number two, they have medicines that help them conquer diseases in the interior of Africa, that let them explore further inland. But I do think, Keith, to your question, it does play a bit of a role. But there are also a bunch of other factors at play. It certainly doesn't help. I'll put it that way.
Thank you.
Okay, who is next? Yes, go ahead,
I
please.
feel like you kind of answered it already, but I just wondered, like, watching the volume of people that were being enslaved and moved, like, assuming that they were, you know, trading people who were young enough to be able to work for a long period of time and reproduce, like, how were they sustaining that volume of population to, like, keep, you know, just like, keep, like, feeding the trade? Like, where were all the people coming from?
Well, this is actually an important question to keep in mind, because what's essentially happening is that those kingdoms on the coastline are having to go further and further inland to find more and more enslaved laborers. And so it causes an effect to where it's becoming more destabilizing as time goes by, where kingdoms that were once very peaceful toward one another are having conflicts over trying to stop this enslavement from going on and continuing. The thing is that your question also raises the point of something that historians thought about for decades now, which is, has Africa as a continent fully recovered from the slave trade?
Right.
You know, because Keith, you asked your question about European colonization as well. We go back even further to this era of slavery and colonization. And it's quite clear the damage is still lingering even today on both sides of the Atlantic. Because again, keep in mind, this whole system, I don't want to blame just Christopher Columbus, but his exploration of the New World is a major impetus for the Europeans to conduct this slave trade in the first place. Now, the first use of enslaved labor by the Europeans was actually in places like Madeira in the Atlantic Ocean in the 1440s and 50s. But it's really when they're trying to colonize the New World that they become more heavily dependent on African labor. And the effects of that we're still seeing today. Yes.
So you started this lecture by saying that we may not know much about Africa, but in 5 years, we will. What did you mean?
Well, in essence, that is in part talking about how Americans in general, we tend not to pay attention to other parts of the world unless we're at war with them or a war in them. And with Africa, if you read current headlines, you'll see, for example, we have AFRICOM, like an African command that controls American troops all over the continent. We have had special forces conducting operations all over Africa for years now. A buddy of mine who's in the Army, he got deployed to Africa a few years ago, and he couldn't tell me where he went. He said, "I'm going to Africa. That's all I can tell you." Right. At the same time, we know that there is plenty of interest in Africa from nations like China, for example.
Absolutely.
Of course,
Russia.
European nations like France have long had interest in Africa. And what we're seeing now is that US foreign policy is starting to pivot towards how do we maintain a powerful presence on the African continent? And so that's what I was talking about. That it's already starting, but it's going to accelerate over time.
I've been there to West Africa, and I've saw Chinese in the fish market and said, "How did he get here?" This is 20-something years ago. But there's a movie out called The Grab that answered some of the question that it posed.
Absolutely. All right, Penn Center, you're up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask who ordered, funded, and financed the slave trade, and what was the estimated cost, and where has it been proportionally distributed?
Okay, so the first question about who funded it is more like who didn't fund it, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm serious in terms of not just European governments, but also key banks all over Europe played a major role in the transatlantic slave trade. And in the weeks to come, we'll talk about American companies that invested in slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. Wall Street in America plays a role in the slave trade in the 18th and 19th century. That's actually what it was originally used for, was trading slaves. So in terms of who invests in it, European nations, including, again, I mentioned Sweden and Denmark, nations we don't normally associate with slavery are also finding ways to make money off of it by supplying ships, sailors and crew to conduct the slave trade, and so forth. Now, in terms of the cost, well, I cannot give you a number off the top of my head, but I can tell you it is a rather large number. I'll give you some context for this. In 1860, we're going a bit forward in the class now, but in 1860, when the southern states are about to secede from the Union, what is clear is that the total value of enslaved labor in the South surpasses just about anything else in the US at that time. And we're talking about in the billions of dollars. That's just the United States. Now, if you're talking about the total cost of the slave trade, the number is astronomical, to say the least. It almost can't be fathomed. How I would answer your question in a different way is that you cannot imagine global history since 1492 without the slave trade.
Right.
Like you cannot conceive of it without that there. That's not a good number estimate, but I think it gets across just how important it was. And again, in the weeks to come, we'll be looking at those numbers from an American angle, but in terms of the entire transatlantic slave trade, it is an astronomical number, to say the least. Yes.
I don't want to ask this exactly, but I'm gonna try. How could I think to compare the slave trade that you just described with the kind of internal systems of slavery that existed in, say, the Ottoman Empire, the medieval European kingdoms during that whole period that led up to 1492, and then during that, I'm thinking of like prisoners of war, but what else could we?
Well, the big difference, of course, is the creation of race in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, with the other systems of slavery you mentioned, with the Ottoman Empire, with medieval Europe, etc. For example, the word slave itself, the root of that is Slav, right, from Eastern Europe. But what you see is that while slavery is important in the Ottoman Empire, in medieval Europe, etc., it takes on a new and different form with the transatlantic slave trade, where it is helping to create almost brand new civilizations out of whole cloth in the Americas. And I think, again, we're talking about the differences here. It is difficult to talk about this without, again, talking about the creation of race, racial categorization and the like. Now, in the Ottoman Empire, for example, you have differences in terms of ethnicity and religious belief. Medieval Europe, you have some of that too, but it becomes a much bigger thing. We're talking about the Americas and that transatlantic slave trade. Also, the transatlantic slave trade is the incubator for a number of conflicts in Africa that really helped to drive these various empires into the ground throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Last question.
Well, which came first? The conception, our modern conceptions of race?
Oh, see, I knew something that. The answer is yes. No. So the question you just raised about which came first, the idea of race or slavery. I alluded to this a moment ago. It's hard to say. This is why I say that. I would say that with slavery, what happens in the transatlantic context of slavery is that racism becomes a very useful excuse for continuing the slave trade. Because you got to keep in mind, as slavery grows and develops in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, there are plenty of people who are opposed to it, least of all the enslaved themselves. But there are also Europeans who are writing documents and tracts saying this is terrible. If we're true Christians, we shouldn't support this. If we believe in the Enlightenment, we shouldn't support this. And so race and racism grow and develop over time. But the reason I said that, I jokingly said yes to answer your question, is that there is also some evidence, again, inconclusive so far, that some of the peoples of Europe, when they looked towards peoples of Africa, it's unclear what they thought of them. We have some ideas they may have thought that they were certainly different. But there's that question of, did they see them as inferior, as alien? It depends on which society you look at. But to answer your question, you really can't have slavery grow and develop without the growth and development of race and racism, which we're going to get more into next week with Carolina Colony.
Dr. Green, there was a tremendous hand going up right there.
Sure, go right ahead.
Voice I hadn't heard. I'm wondering what is that.
Sorry, I wanted to ask about that mapping because there were a lot of boats going to like Brazil and Haiti, and not many going to like the US, but obviously there was still like a large African American population in the United States. So I was just wondering why that would be. Like if it just.
Well, so I'll start this answer off by making it clear that slavery across the New World was horrific. If you were an enslaved African brought to North America, the Caribbean, or Brazil, you lived a difficult and terrible life. However, slavery in places like Brazil and Saint Domingue, Haiti, or Cuba were especially brutal. Barbados as well, other parts of the Caribbean because of the climate, and also because of what they're growing, sugarcane, which is a very, very labor-intensive crop. Now, the thing is, you see so many ships going to Brazil, especially because the enslaved population cannot support itself. So many enslaved people are dying. They're having to bring more enslaved people into Brazil, into Saint Domingue, keep population going. Whereas North America, what happens by the 18th century, in the early 19th century, is that the enslaved population is able to keep itself going through reproduction. Just enough to let the U.S., out of the goodness of its own heart, to leave the slave trade in 1808. But what happens there, we'll get into this next week, is that you see an internal slave trade within the United States of states like Maryland, Virginia, even the Carolinas, shipping slaves further south and west to Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, places like that. To answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. You think of it, I'm 65, as I said, about 6 generations prior to me, they were slaves, my ancestors. So just takes time to reproduce people. And
I'll give you an even better example of my own personal life. My father, who is 63 now, told me a story of his grandmother, my great-grandmother, telling him about knowing enslaved people when she grew up. And then them telling her stories of literally having to eat out of a trough as enslaved people. So again, slavery, we think of it as being so long ago, but it's not. It's really not. Okay, on that note, next thing. Again, this is just the first class of the Modjeska School. Don't forget that this Sunday we have a Sunday session that will go more in depth with Indigenous life in South Carolina. We're bringing my Professor Judge for that one. I had Professor Judge as well. He did a great job tonight talking about Indigenous life. And next week, we are going to talk about the founding of Carolina Colony, the place that we currently refer to as South Carolina, and how this has influenced and influences the slave trade, Indigenous life in the Americas, and going all the way up to the Revolution and the writing of the Constitution. Brett?
I just want to thank everybody out there at Zoom land and appreciate you being there, and get in touch with us at the network address if you've got any logistical questions or difficulty getting in or getting your homework.
Yeah, and so in addition to the learning and the discussions we have in the class, we're trying to build community here. So after class, if you have to run, that's fine, but you're also welcome to stay and socialize and get to meet your classmates. We would encourage the same to happen at Penn Center and the South Sumter Resource Center. And for the online participants, Becky is going to stay online, and so there can be a online discussion as well on Zoom. But because of to keep the different conversations from covering one another up, the group organizations, I'd recommend jump off the call so we're not cluttering up the audio of the participants who are on Zoom.
Thank you, Becky.
All right, thank you all. I'll see you guys next week. Same bat time, same bat. That's the joke my students at Claflin do not get, but some of the folks do. So then have a good one.
Good night, everybody.
Bye, Becky.
Have a good evening.